No sooner had the warm liquid mixed with crumbs touched my palate than a shudder ran through me. And I stopped, intent upon the extraordinary thing that was happening to me. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, something isolated, detached with no suggestion of its origin. And at once the vicissitudes of life had become indifferent to me, its disasters innocuous, its brevity illusory. And this new sensation, having had an effect on me, of which love has of filling me with a precious essence. Or rather, this essence was not in me, it was me. That was Marcel Proust near the beginning of Swann's Way, talking about the effect of a morsel of food entering his mouth and precipitating an amazing narrative. Clay creation and community are the morsel within us this evening. As Deb said, we journey here from many places. We're inspired by the example of our forebears. Thank you, Cindy. Who established a circle of discourse of ceramic artists and educators in NCECA. As we assemble to celebrate this sense of connection, we hope to bring into focus over the next few days some conversations about clay's intimate connection with food and the seamless integration of taste, touch, and material as artfulness in our daily lives, that is ceramic art. Fred Opie is a professor of histories and foodways at Babson College. He's the author of several books, including his two most recent ones, Upsetting the Apple Cart, Black and Latino Coalitions in New York from Protest to Public Office, and his brand new book, Zora Neale Hurston on Florida Food, Recipes, Remedies, and Simple Pleasures. Fred will be signing his book after the talk this evening and again tomorrow morning, so I'd encourage you that if you enjoy what you hear to get outside and have a conversation with him and bring home his book and continue thinking about some of the depth of research, consideration that he's given to this topic. Fred's also the editor of the blog foodislens.com and is a contributor on the radio show The Splendid Table that many of you have heard on NPR, as I did when I first had heard Fred's voice coming to me in West Virginia. In addition to his academic career, Fred is also an accomplished athlete. He's included playing on the lacrosse team at Syracuse University. Go Syracuse, go Orange. And he was also part of a World Cup team with the US men's national lacrosse team in Perth, Australia in 1990. Believe it. He's excited to be here, delving with us into the ancient history of the links between food, beverage, and clay objects through a look at Aztec, Maya, and Inca societies before 1492, 300 some odd years before the lively experiment started here in Rhode Island. So get ready to explore with him the questions that drive this year's keynote address. Who made earth and cooking and eating and drinking objects? What status did their artisan crafts give to them? How did their work become distributed or exchanged? Who used ceramics to cook and serve the beverages? What foods and beverages did they make? Thank you, Fred, for being here.
Well, good evening. You look more awake than my 9:45 class this morning. I want to thank your organization for inviting me for many reasons, but probably most important to me is that you have made something that I have taken for granted for a long time. I have become so fixated on food and food traditions that I often forget the importance of the objects used to cook the food and to serve the food. You probably are familiar with the book by Ralph Ellison, The Invisible Man. And I'm embarrassed to say that until I was invited to come speak to you, that's pretty much how I have treated ceramics as a scholar. And now I have my eyes open and I see ceramics just about everywhere. You know, we had to replace my wife's car about 3 years ago. And everybody knows the experience when you decide you know what you want. what happens? You begin to see it everywhere. And that's how it was with my wife's car. My kids would go, Daddy, there it is. Daddy, there it is. Is that the one we're getting? Is that the one we're getting? Well, that's how I am with ceramics after being invited here. I literally see ceramics everywhere, and it's opened up just a whole new vista of looking at food and thinking about food. So thank you very much for the invitation to come out and speak to you all. I'm going to do a presentation, nothing like the one we just saw, which was fantastic, folks from Kansas City. And I know this organization is a very savvy one, because if I was planning the next location, I would want to go to one of the best barbecue cities in the country. So, very smart move. Okay, so we're going to talk about earthenware and talk about it in the context of what I call First Nation people. And I want to do it in a way that's dynamic because it's the kind of presentations I enjoy. Here is the capital of what became the Aztec Empire. My Nahua pronunciation isn't very good, but I call it Tenochtitlan. This is the capital city of the Aztec Empire. And key to understanding this empire is that, first of all, as you will see in the next image, that it's built upon a waterway. And some of you could understand the importance of being close to a waterway in your own craft. So ceramics certainly played an important role within the Aztec Empire, but even more so within the capital city, which functioned as the metropole for the Aztec world. This is by no means an egalitarian society. This is a society that's built on what we call cooperative relationships with those who are considered among the Aztec elite as lesser groups who bring tributary to them. And part of the tributes that they bring to them is certainly ceramics, as we will see. So if you look at this image here, this is the city that was built up over many, many decades to become the head or the capital of the empire, and it is the current location for Mexico City. But there are causeways that cover all these bodies of water, and no doubt along the shores of these water were probably the places where people would harvest their clay. The first part I want to ask you or talk to you about is who actually makes the clay within the Aztec world, the Maya world, and Inca world. Well, we know within Aztec society, and by the way, this is a mural by Diego Rivera, and it's a great way to show you some of the dimensions within society and how they relate to ceramics. So how do you know who has status within the Aztec world as well as the Mayan and the Inca world? Well, one way you know is by clothing. And if you look around, you will see the elites tend to have bright colors. It's the same thing with their ceramics as well. Their ceramics are much more ornate than a commoner would have. If you look at elites, if you can see them, you'll notice sandals. By the way, this is Frida Kahlo, if you haven't noticed. Diego manages to put Frida in just about everything that he would create. But elites tend to have huaraches or sandals. Non-elites tend to be barefoot. Elites have, I said, bright colors. They tend to have things like earrings, all kinds of artisan crafts that speak to their culture. They also had sumptuary laws, laws that dictated what they could wear, what they couldn't wear. They had sumptuary laws that dictated what they could drink and what others couldn't drink. So all these go into talking about ceramics. So we do know within Aztec societies that the craft of making things out of clay, first of all, was a male institution. It was certainly a male institution. We have no scholarship to show women involved in the making of ceramics. We also know that it is commoners. This is not something that an Aztec elite would be participating in whatsoever. So that's one thing we know about who actually made it. Within the Aztec world, the artisans that produce ceramics, they tended to have more than one job. They would be farmers and artisans who would make pottery. they would have many different jobs. Now, what's interesting is I spend a lot of time around living museums, and if you look on Instagram and look at the photos and images I have there, you'll see some from old Sturbridge Village, which is on the border of Massachusetts and Connecticut. And they have a beautiful rendition of a potter's barn, a kiln, and the whole bit. And when you talk to the interpreters in the potter's barn, that was not a full-time job. It was something that you were a farmer and a potter. You were somebody who did something and also you did pottery. Well, it was for the most part the same way within the Aztec world. You had more than one job. And this is going to be different when I talk about the Maya and the Inca. Another example of the hierarchies within society, again, as I said, the clothing, the mask, all these things are examples of, I guess, what you would call bling Aztec style, okay? And part of the bling Aztec style was also the vessels that they ate off of and that they drank from. All those have to do with status within Aztec, Inca, and Maya society. Similarly, when you have a guest come, I know in my house, we have probably 2 or 3 sets of dishes, all right? So you have the paper cups, plastic cups, you have everyday cups, and then you have Thanksgiving Day ceramics. All right, I have 2 platters that came from Mexico. I did all my language training in Mexico, so if some of you are thinking back there, why is this very tall African-American man talking about Aztec culture and society? Because for me, I spent so much time in graduate school in Mexico, it very much feels a part of my culture and society. And one of the things that I would do when I would come back from Mexico is I would buy all kinds of ceramics. So we have 3 beautiful ceramic platters that we use for parties at our house. And the only time they come out is for a special event. Aztecs were the same way. There were the everyday type of consuming vessels, and then there are the special occasion ones. Now, if you're an Aztec elite, the ornate ones are everyday vessels for you. If you're a commoner, the only time you're breaking out the night stuff is on a religious holiday or a ritual. So it's very similar to how we look at vessels today. We have common things, we have things that are a little bit better and more important to us, but then when somebody important comes to the house, we break out the stuff that stays in the closet like I do, and I'm sure like as you do. This particular picture I'm showing to you again because I want to talk about how did the creations of artisans become distributed. First of all, an artisan did have a great deal of status within Aztec, Inca, and Maya society because you were commissioned by a member of the nobility to produce something, and your association with that nobility gave you status. The ability for you to make a vessel that would impress a guest of that nobility also gave you status. What we knew though within Maya society, we're going to talk about them in a second, is that artisans signed their creations. So they not only signed it with their names, but they signed it with the names of the people who commissioned them to make it. And so it was definitely a sense of status. People looked at artisans very much like gods. People who could take nothing, clay, from the shore, bring it to their homes, bring it to their workplace, and make it a living creation. So they were held in very high esteem. We also know within Aztec society that an artisan were one of the few people within society that were literate. They could read cosmology. They could study all the most important parts of their science, and they were considered high, people of high status within their society. So how did their creations get distributed? Well, one of the ways we know is this is a marketplace right here. There are some commonalities we know between the Aztec, Mayan, and Inca, and say ancient societies in Africa, West and Central Africa, which I also study. And we know that the marketplace was a place for women. Local trade was carried on by women. Trade in ceramics by women. Long distance trade tended to be a male occupation. So if you were to go to the capital city, and we have, if you look at the piece I put in the newsletter, the journal for your organization, there's a longer piece that opens with a description by Cortez about the marketplace and the ceramics that he sees in Tenochtitlan, the capital city. So here we have women selling all kinds of goods, but they're also selling ceramics. They're selling food and they're selling ceramics. Now, this is not just any woman, these are commoners. You wouldn't see an elite woman selling goods in the marketplace. It's an occupation of a common woman, of an entrepreneur. So we know that their goods travel locally within the marketplace, but it also, anytime you had a guest, and my wife, excuse me, is a Southerner, anytime we go or invited to somebody's house, she is just programmed to, we gotta bring something. Well, in Aztec society, it was both you brought something, and very often it was an ornate piece of ceramics, but you also gave something, an ornate piece of ceramic. And we'll show you some examples of that as we go along. But it was a way of creating relationships with people and maintaining political alliances. So therefore, that artisan meant a lot to you as a political leader because your leadership and your alliances depended on how much you could impress your guest. So certainly that piece of ceramics meant a lot to political leaders within Aztec society. Here's an example of what do we know about what people made on top of, inside of, and served with ceramics. Certainly the most important aspect of the culinary history of the people we're talking about today is corn. The Aztec and the Maya are known as people of corn. In the case of the Maya, what they would call their creation story comes out of what's known as the Popol Vuh. And the description of the creation story is the gods making a human being from a lump of corn, from masa. That is the corn that's ground down and then made into, almost like a potter's clay. That's the creation story among the Aztec and the Maya. So if you look in here, you will see pictures or depictions of people grinding corn into masa, okay? You see a woman stirring. There's a good chance that what she's stirring could be chocolate, which is an important part of Aztec culture and society. Very different than the kind of chocolate we would think about now. On the way in, I had somebody randomly handing out chocolate. If you got one of those chocolates, can you raise your hand so I can see it? Oh, you lucky little people, look at you. And you know you're supposed to share, all right? That's from the Taza Chocolate Company, which is based in Somerville, Massachusetts, not far from here. But what you see with chocolate is a special occasion food, again, associated for having a guest, a wedding, a political alliance, or a religious festival. And chocolate within Aztec and Mayan Inca society is not sweet. It's a savory, spicy substance, and it's not consumed as a solid, it's consumed as a liquid. The ability to take your chocolate and make a froth like you would a latte was something, if you were going to impress your guests, the bigger the froth, the more impressive the guest would be. So it's a very different sense. We don't have sweetened chocolate until after 1492, when Columbus on his second voyage brings sugarcane from the islands off of West Africa and introduces those sugarcane plants to the Caribbean, and then sugar takes off. So there's no such thing as a sweetened candy bar within Aztec Maya Inca society. It's what we call a Columbian exchange that happens after 1492. As I said to you, the concept of Inca Maya society, the most important staple is corn. But the conception of corn that they have within their world is far vaster than what we have. As you can see from this image, there are many varieties of corn within all these societies. And every variety has a different use, a different taste, and it's used on a different occasion. The same way you would have ceramics that would represent different feelings about people of importance, depending on your corn, would be the same way. One of the most interesting culinary inventions or creations among the Maya is a piece of corn that they let the fungus develop on the corn. And it is a delicacy within Mexican society to this day. It's a certain corn, they let the fungus grow, then they harvest the fungus and they cook it and they use it in a dish, in a taco. but it's a tremendous amount of things. So if you talk about corn, there are just so many different ways, probably as many ways as we use hot dogs, you know, something like that. I was listening to a show on NPR yesterday where this cook came up with this delicious savory dish that was barbecued ribs with sauerkraut. You're going, how could that work? It works. Well, fungus on corn, it works. It's just how it is. Second aspect, so you know, often scholars talk about the diet of the Aztec, Maya, and the Inca as the three sisters. The first one of the sisters is corn. The second of the sisters is the bean. Black beans, red beans are indigenous to the Americas. Corn, indigenous to the Americas, and an integral part of their foodways. So you would see a lot of descriptions of the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, taking beans and consuming them in many different ways, including making them to a powder, making them to a soup, or deep frying them or refrying them. And so, you know, the concept of beans has as many different interpretations as far as culinary taste as the corn. So that's the second triad. And then the third trinity within the three sisters is squash. Squash is indigenous. Pumpkins, squash, all those are indigenous to the Americas. You can see the original plant begin in the Americas, and it's an important part. So all these dishes would be prepared at that time using ceramics, ceramic pots, grinding them down, taking the seed from the squash and using those, grind them down into different powders, toasting them, making them with spicy things. One thing's interesting, if you spend any time in Mexico, I'm not a person who grew up liking a lot of spice. My wife and my kids, they have to have hot sauce on everything. That's not me. But when you live in Mexico, the weather is so hot, one of the things you notice that the children, and everybody, but particularly notice with children, when you buy street food like peanuts or something like that, all the street food that is sweet usually has some cayenne pepper or something really spicy hot on top. And you're looking at these people like, what are they doing? This is crazy, right? Well, it was crazy, but after 3 months, guess who was doing it? And what I found out is in every society that has a hot climate, people consume spicy food. Why? Because it causes gastrointestinal sweating, which cools your body. So that's why you see people who come from hot climates consume a lot of spicy foods. And it's the same you see among the Aztec, Inca, and the Maya. Tomatoes, not part of the Trinity, but an important part in American plant. And you see salsa, green salsa, red salsas as a very important part of what you see the Aztec consume. It's a diet high in corn, a high in beans, and then the topping of the condiment will also be some type of tomato-based salsa. Again, green tomatoes, salsa verde, or you'll see red tomatoes. And mushrooms. Mushrooms an integral part of their cuisine as well. Foraging has become a boom industry with many high-end restaurants throughout the United States. But that was just a way of life among people during this time period we're talking about, whether it's in the Americas or you see same thing among people in West and Central Africa. Foraging these things, the ability to go out and know mushrooms not only for consumption but for medicinal properties as well. So this is another important part that you would see within Aztec society. Some of the best tacos I've ever had actually in Mexico has been a mushroom taco. Now let's change to Mayan society and talk a little bit about the differences there. If you look at the region of Chiapas, which is the most southern region of Mexico or contemporary Mexico, that's the region that where you would say the Mayan Empire began. Now, the Mayan Empire is very different. There were several different empires. There never was so much a capital city, but several capital cities. But one of the things we know about the Maya is that they're probably known more than anything else for the detail in their ceramics. And I have some images that you'll see. So among the three groups we'll talk about tonight, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, Maya artisans probably would be considered the most talented when it comes to detail, and you'll see this in some of the images I have here. Can anybody recognize what that is? A cacao, exactly. So again, cacao is one of those things that you probably see more in the description of the Maya than any other. Certainly corn is important, squash is important, beans are important, but we see a lot of these images around the Maya. And when you consumed your chocolate drink within Mayan society, it was often you did one-on-one, which leads me to think that it was a very important part. You know, we remember a while back there were some problems between one of our local professors here in Boston and a police officer in Boston, and it led to the famous beer gate at the White House. Well, you would have had the chocolate gate if the same thing happened during this time period. That's how people consumed it. I also know in Russian society, it's considered bad manners and even a sign of senility if you drink alone. When it came to chocolate consumption, it was the same thing you see within Mayan society. These are the tools that were used to make the froth we're talking about. So the seeds within the cacao would be ground down, and then they would be mixed, and you would have the salt or the chilies added to it, and then it would be mixed in and served with this. So this is what I mean when I talk about, and this is the actual company that you guys are consuming, some of you in the audience, and you are sharing with the people around you. Yeah. So here's a vessel where, again, this came from an exhibit which I think is still going on at the Boston Museum of Science. There's a large Mayan exhibit. From here, if you're driving, it probably wouldn't take any more than an hour and 15 minutes to get there. But these are images I actually shot at the museum of Mayan vessels. A vessel like this would be used to make beans. The image I have in my mind, when I think about my time in Mexico, and I stayed with a host family for many different summers, the image that I have in my mind is always a clay pot at the back of the stove percolating with beans on it. And it would cook this for hours and hours and hours. If you're a Southerner, that pot would be full with collard greens. If you're from Mayan society in Mesoamerica, it's going to be full with different beans. So that's one of the things that you see here. Now, the same pot, when we get to the Inca, and also among the Aztec consumed an alcoholic beverage called poke. Again, poke used in religious services as well. Chocolate often was a fermented drink, but poke would be a beverage that was made from a plant somewhat as far as its relationship to agave. But it's one of these drinks. Poke you see among the Aztec. Among the Maya, you see alcoholic or fermented chocolate. Among the Inca, we'll talk about chicha, but all made in these large ceramic vessels. And then what are they served? They're served in, again, here's an example of what I'm talking about. You come visit me, you're a high-ranking official, or you're somebody who I need your political alliance with. I present your dish to you. In the case of the Maya, most importantly, they're going to be serving you tamales, all different type of tamales. But they're going to serve it in a dish like this. And the dish is going to be served to you, and probably that dish will go home with you. And we all know the feeling when you go to somebody's house, they give you a great dish, they really love you, they give you something to take home with you. So that's often what you're going to see in a situation like that. A very elaborate dish that's going to be full of tamales. Another dish that'll be full with a different course that you would be served. And the more courses that are brought out, the more prestige and status you have. So how do I determine my status? Well, if I'm the artisan, imagine the artisan sitting off to the side as the dishes come rolling out. Yeah, that's one of mine. Here is one of the drinking beverages that I'm talking about. You can see the detail. So the image that you would see in this, very often, this may be the person who commissioned the creation of this beverage, drinking beverage, or you could see somewhere in the detail some kind of initial of the actual artist. So those are things that you would see. But this is a vessel that may have been produced simply for a specific visitor coming, for a marriage, at the birth of a child, at the death of a ruler. These are the kind of things that would be produced. Here's another one. Again, distinctively a Mayan one that you can see here. And the status of the person who commissioned it, you see in the headdress that they have. And again, if you knew what you were looking for, you could probably see the image or the signature of the artist within this. Again, a beverage that would be more than likely used to consume a high quality grade of chocolate. It's not that commoners didn't consume chocolate. It's not that commoners didn't consume tamales. But what made you different was the quantity and the quality and the frequency with which you had access to the type of chocolate that you were drinking. Here's another example of a Mayan vessel. And I'm not sure the difference of the color schemes. I'm sure they probably have some symbolic reasons. The same way when we have different holidays, we have colors associated with them. I'm not sure what that is, but we do know that each and every one of these things had a symbolic reason. They weren't done by happenstance. Now, let's turn to the Incas. And the Inca, I want to emphasize a couple things. I mentioned chicha, but the other thing I want to emphasize is the Incas, who are the artisans within Inca society, and how are the vessels used. The Inca Empire goes from modern day Ecuador all the way down into the region of Argentina. It's the biggest of the three empires we'll talk about today. What's key for the Inca is their supply chain. Along their way, they created a highway system that allowed their empire to have a thriving trade system. And along these highways, the same way the gentleman up here mentioned the armory here in Boston. Well, the Incas also had armories. But what was kept in those armories were actually stores of potatoes. And during a time of famine, how they carried favor with you as a local leader is when you needed that food, they would roll it out, and the expectation was when they needed you to roll out militarily, you would come out for them. But throughout their empire, they had these stores of freeze-dried potatoes. I'll show you an image of potatoes in a minute. But it really is an important thing to keep in mind. It's the largest empire we know, and we know that potatoes played another important role. Another thing that you learn about the Inca is that there's not just a potato. It is potatoes, all different sizes, produced and cooked in all different ways within their culture and society. And from the Inca, the potato has spread out all over the world. Now, here's an image of an Inka Noble. Again, if you're on Instagram, you can see a little bit more detail that I put of this image that's on Instagram. But here you see ceramic vessels, and they're marked with the word chicha. Okay, so this is the kind of containers. Now, chicha made within Inca society is a couple really interesting things for it. Number one, every one of the vessels that was produced to make chicha was commissioned by the Inca state. Now, wouldn't you love, as people in the ceramics field, to have all your clay delivered to your house? No more hauling that stuff on your back, but delivered to your house by the state. But there's a catch, that every one of the vessels has to be made to the Inca dimensions. So they produce every one of the containers, males within the society. There are communities which are established strictly for producing these ceramic vessels for making chicha within Inca society. Number two, which is interesting about chicha. Chicha is a corn-based beer, and it's the work of women. And there are women who are chosen, and for the remainder of their life, when they're chosen, they're responsible for making chicha. They take the corn, they masticate it in their mouth, and then they put it into these containers, and it ferments. And they have to do that in large numbers. So there are villages throughout the Inca world that produce these things. Produce the vessels, there's communities dedicated to producing the vessels, there's communities dedicated to producing the chicha. And chicha is shipped by the state throughout. Now, why does the state have such involvement in the production of the ceramic vessels for chicha and the production of chicha? Because within the Maya world, they have what they call the MITA system, M-I-T-A. It's a labor system. And it's a requirement that within this system, for 2 to 3 months, you will leave your community and you will do public work for the Inca state. It could be constructing or repairing one of the highways. It could be constructing or comparing a religious tomb, or it could be the housing for Inca. Okay, but this is one of the things. Now, And reciprocation for this, when you did this work, you were given beer. That was like your salary. That's what you would be giving. So you can see the importance of producing this chicha, because if you don't produce the chicha, you're gonna have a labor strike on your hands, or probably a rebellion. So it's really important. Now, some takeaways from this. First of all, I would say the most important thing is to keep in mind that ceramics are a male production within these societies, all three societies we're talking about. Number two, the production of food and beverages is a female occupation within these societies. You have a great deal of status when you can make these vessels within these societies. The more elaborate your painting, your creation, the more prestige you have as a person. So certainly to be somebody within these societies who did ceramics is you're a person of high status. And if you could pass that trade on to people within your family or in your community, you also had a great deal of status. That's the first one I would say. So when we talk about who made it, it's men. When we talk about the status, very high status individuals. Certainly not nobles. We don't see any noble within those societies, but we see close relationship between the nobles and the artisans that make these earthenwares. How did their work become distributed? Within local markets, and then they were shipped throughout the empire. One of the things I didn't mention is cacao was also a currency within these societies. So when you were going to purchase something like ceramics in a local market, often you would do it with the exchange for cacao. If you were purchasing something, you could take a ceramic good and use it to exchange for something you wanted. So that's, we know, long distance trade and local trade. These things were handed out as gifts and brought back to different people's communities. And who cooked and served the food? It's women. Distinctively a female thing, and it's among the commoners. Just like today in society, if you have a whole lot of money, more than likely, you're not gonna be producing your food. You're gonna have somebody who comes to your house and produce your food. Same thing we see within all three of these different worlds, the Aztec, Inca, and Maya world. And what food did they make? We talk about the Aztec. It's something that's corn-based. It's something with a lot of chilies. It's something with the three sisters. We talked about corn, beans, and squash. There are also many animals that are consumed within Aztec society, and fish. One of the things that we know about Aztec society is the ideal of consuming not only things like mongoose, but things also like dogs. These were all part of consumption. The turkey is indigenous to Mesoamerica. That's something else you will see. So meat is consumed, but keep in mind, there is no pork, there's no hog yet, that's 1492. There is no cattle, that's 1492. There is no goat, that's 1492. So all these things are changes that happened to the culinary worlds of all three people after 1492. Let's turn to some questions and comments. There's mics set up around the room here. I would love to hear your questions. Hopefully I can answer your questions, but please, somebody be bold enough to step up and get us started with some questions. Yes?
I know this is probably an outdated piece of information, but I heard that Cabi was a popular Incan dish. What was it used for, and what would have it been served in?
You said...
Cabi, as in guinea pig.
Oh, it was. Thank you. It was popular. It was our version of filet mignon. It's a special occasion dish that somebody's consumed. You still see people consume it now in the Andean region. So it's one of those things where, you know, when you show it to my students, they're like, oh my God, they're eating my pet. But for them, it's, you know, it's something different. So it's a great question. Yes?
Like in the Chinese culture, when they drink tea or they make tea, the teapot that is used is often reserved specifically for a certain kind of tea. And if you make another kind of tea, use a different teapot. To what extent was this kind of thing true for the Aztec, the Mayan, or the Incan civilizations?
I have several images that I put on Instagram, and I have different types of pots and vases. I'm not sure which ones were used for which. We do know that the round ones, those big round ones, were used for multiple things like poke, chicha, and chocolate. But is there a specific one for each one? No. We do know that as far as drinking vessels, that the more ornate ones were for the more, for the special occasions. That's probably the best way I could answer that one.
Okay, thank you.
There's also mics on either side. Can I go over here?
Yes. When I was much younger, I lived in southern Mexico with a Maya family in a town called Amatenango, which was a pottery town. And in that town, only the women made pottery. The men dug the clay and they fired the pots, but they did not make them. And I was wondering if you can tell us something about how did that change after the Spanish came? Because the other thing that I'm going to say is in a lot of the places where they made more of the Spanish-influenced pottery, it was all men. So I would just be interested in what you had to say about that.
That's a great question. I'm assuming that comes with 1492 in the definition of who does what. That's what I'm assuming. I'll give you an example. In West and Central Africa, working in the field was considered women's work. So imagine being an African taken in captivity, sent to Mexico, sent to Colombia, sent to wherever to work in the sugarcane field. You have, in that person's mind, now challenged their masculinity. So things certainly changed. I'm not sure, but I'm certain that that has something to do with 1492. We also know that when the Spanish came, what they did is they tapped into the system of giving tribute that nobles had, and they had commoners give them tribute. And one of the things they received in tribute also were ceramics. So it could be that as one's husband or one's son, the males in the house were out being forced to work in another, somebody had to come up with another version. So they might have been drafted into a battle, but I don't have an exact answer on that. It's a very interesting question. Yes?
What is the role of quinoa? As far as I understand, quinoa was used for a beverage like chicha.
Quinoa, more than anything else, is consumed as a staple within Andean society. By the way, what's really interesting is countries like Ecuador, where quinoa, some of the most important grains and original plants of quinoa, it's now illegal to take it out of Ecuador because everybody and their brother is trying to get some of these original plants and take them and raise them outside the country. But more than not, it was consumed as a staple, not so much as a beverage. Now, if you think of the image of the beans, keep in mind when you think about Latin American society, you think about rice and beans. Now, rice doesn't come to Latin America and is not cooked in any clay pots until after 1492. There are two species of rice in the world. There's a species that comes from Asia, and there's a species that comes from Africa. So during the African slave trade, rice introduced itself to the Latin America as slaves were brought there. But quinoa was one of those things that served as the rice-like staple throughout South America, cooked in ceramic pots. Yes?
Can you talk about the importance of the quero and the introduction of the Spanish of vessels like the aribalo? And one more thing, the word that the lady was talking was the cuy, the guinea pig, cuy.
Cuy, guinea pig. The first part of your question, ma'am, you said the Cato. I'm not sure if it's a Quechua version of is it a vessel? A religious vessel. The most important thing I can say is when you look at these religious ceremonies within all three societies, ceramics are so important. It's like if you were to go and take communion. If you notice how people handle communion vessels, typically they're covered with white cloth and they're given great sense of reverence. That's how the ceramic vessels were treated among all three societies. So they're super important. You may drink out of some of them only during a high holy day within their society. So they're super important. I don't want you to think that they're everyday vessels. They are important vessels, and they may have a different one depending on the religious holidays. Yes?
The chicha vessel, was that standardized just for like the ease of production, or did that affect the size and dimensions of that vessel, affect the fermentation of the beer?
Not sure about the fermentation, but it's a great point. What the Incas did is they decided to create a standardized, this is what we use forgive me for I can't think of any better analogy to send out our bud beer, all right? But then there was the chicha beer that was higher quality. And they did not supply the best clay for the ceramics that was given to the nobility. So there's the common clay for everybody that drinks Bud, Bud Light. And then there's the high quality chicha that's made in certain ceramic vessels that only the nobles have access to and only the best corn to produce that chicha. So that's a great question. It's a standardized way, but it's a way of creating status. This is what we drink out of, that's what you drink out of. Great question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for your presentation. It's really fascinating. Really like listening to it.
Thank you.
I know your specialty is food and not so much ceramics and potters, but I don't know if you can help with this or not. The Spaniards come along and they introduced the wheel as well as other types of food. I know the Spanish were crazy, just as crazy as the locals for drinking chocolate and whatnot. But what happened to these literate potters, and how were they incorporated or not into the Spanish domain?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer for, but what I do see is very often the Spanish come, they see the most talented, they take those people from communities. But another thing you do too, not only are the Inca, the Mayan, the Aztec nobles giving gifts of ceramics, but I would imagine they're giving gifts of their artisans. What a way to impress somebody, because they certainly did that with enslaved people. They would take their enslaved person and give them as a gift. So there's a good chance that they were given away in that sense. But I'm not sure. I have not seen research on that to see what happens to those artisans. We know their crafts continue, but do they continue to the auspices of Inca ruler, Maya, or Aztec rulers, or are they taken and working for the viceroy? That I don't know. Great question.
Hi, this is hello. Okay, you
Steve,
talk.
how we doing?
Can you hear me?
Last question. Go ahead.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Well, you talked about your. Okay.
We could use the Occupy Wall Street. You say one thing, we all echo it back. No.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. You talked
Thank you.
about how the food of the Incan, Mayan, and Aztec is important, and also how being invited to NCECA kind of opened up your eyes to the pottery world. Has that connected any dots in the research you've already conducted, or just brought more understanding to what you already know, like being introduced to the pottery and like doing more research on it?
I think it's both. First of all, one of the things it did for me in preparing for the talk was understanding the importance of ceremony.
Yeah.
And the role that ceramics play in ceremony. That's something, I've always knew the importance of food. I always talk about special occasion food, but I never talk about special occasion ceramics. And that is key to understanding. Again, imagine if my grandmother, who could make a mean pie, all right? Imagine if she makes that mean pie and puts it on a terrible plate. So there's so much message. And if you want to insult somebody, one thing you can say is don't offer them a seat. But you could really insult somebody by offering them a seat with a raggedy plate that the food is on. So I think it's opened my eyes to the importance of ceremony and the role that ceramics play in ceremony like I've never thought about before. And what it means when you can't afford, when you see people who don't have a lot doing everything they can with what they have, and it's presentation. And I think that's the part that I never really thought about before that I see. The other thing is, it was amazing when I looked at sources on the Iberian world. So even before Spaniards come here, to see descriptions of people making and selling pottery in Spain, throughout Latin America, and then go to West Africa. I don't do a lot of work on Asia, so I can't comment on that. But there were so many commonalities on the use of clay. You wondered, were there somebody on currents going to different parts of the world that were sharing this information, and they all learned the same thing? Because there's a lot of similarity in the shape. One thing you will see differences is decoration, but it's basically the same thing. So that part I found very interesting. Great question. Does anybody here have a birthday today? Today is your birthday. All right. Now, I saw the hand up go over here. I know there's two hands. Steve, did you put it someplace or do I have it? I'm going to give you a copy of the new book for the birthday girl. I saw the first one over here. Second one, I'm sorry, but I saw the one over here first. There's two hands going up. Oh my gosh, I might have to break out and buy some more for you. But I'm going to give you a copy of my book. After the quartet goes, I would love for you to come by the bookstore, maybe out of here, and I'd love to sign it for you. Just let me get it out. Here we go, I think. Oh, here it is. Steve had it hidden for me. He wanted to give it to his wife. The book is called Zora Neale Hurston on Florida Food, Recipes, Remedies, and Simple Recipes. Thank you, and happy birthday.
Thank you.
Can you put that up?
Is this mine?
Nope. Thank you, John.
That was fabulous. Thank you again, Fred, for being a part of our tribe. I really appreciate it. So be sure and pick up a copy of Fred's book, or all four books. Listen for him on Splendid Table and in places around this country. We're so fortunate to have had you. Thank you so much.